region is under a tropical storm warning, with the exception of say Vernon and Rapides parishes. Avoyelles Parish, as you can see there, was added to the tropical storm watch with this latest advisory for the possibility of seeing tropical storm force winds up that way. We also still have, this is actually a storm surge warning, not a storm surge watch, so ignore the watch there at the top. This is a storm surge warning. I'll have to correct that. That is now in effect for coastal portions of Jefferson County, as well as Cameron Parish, Vermilion Parish, lower parts of St. Martin and St. Mary parishes as well. This is for the possibility of seeing more than 3 feet of surge, and some areas are going to see significantly more than 3 feet of surge as the storm makes landfall. This is the wind threat that I was talking about, and this is going to kind of give you an idea of where the highest winds are expected to occur. The areas highlighted in red there, right along the coastline, that is where we're most likely to see our hurricane force winds. So coastal parts of Cameron Parish, coastal portions of Vermilion, coastal portions of Iberia, St. Mary. This is based on the current forecast track and an intensity of 100 miles per hour. Should the storm be stronger, then these hurricane force winds would extend further inland. You can see the much larger swath, though, of strong tropical storm force winds that are expected to move across the region that extends all the way as far west as parts of Jefferson County, Orange County, in southeast Texas. That's why we have those tropical storm warnings up. And pretty much just about all of southwest, central, and south central Louisiana. And these tropical storm force winds are expected to extend further east into southeast Louisiana as well. So a very large swath of potential, say, 58 to 73 mile per hour wind gusts with this system. That's certainly going to be capable of causing at least some scattered power outages across this entire region. So I've been getting a lot of questions about the potential for power outages. When we're talking about strong tropical storm force winds, you know, they're not the devastating kind that are going to destroy houses, but they are certainly strong enough to knock tree branches onto power lines as the storm makes landfall and begins to move inland. Let me come back to me here, because I know you miss my beautiful face. We're looking now. We're going to immediately go away from me again so you can get a better look at this. This is a look at the tropical storm force wind speed probabilities. So we're looking at very high chances now of seeing tropical storm force winds across the region. Roughly an 80 to 90% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds across coastal Cameron, Vermilion, Iberia, St. Martin, and St. Mary's. So extremely likely to see those at this point. A 70 to 80% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds across southwest Louisiana and south central Louisiana away from the immediate coastline. So that's kind of the areas that were highlighted in orange that we just talked about. And then a 50 to 70% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds across coastal parts of Jefferson and Orange counties, and a 40 to 60% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds across central Louisiana, possibly as far north as Alexandria and even Avoyelles Parish. That's why Avoyelles Parish was put into that tropical storm watch with this latest advisory. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Vernon and Rapides parishes find themselves in tropical storm watches at some point tomorrow as well. Hurricane force wind speed probabilities are obviously significantly lower because the hurricane force winds are going to be much narrower, much more confined. We're probably looking at only about a 20 to 40 mile diameter hurricane force wind area, at least as it stands now. And so there's roughly about a 20 to 40% probability of seeing hurricane force winds across coastal portions of Cameron, Vermilion, Iberia, St. Martin, and St. Mary parishes. Lower overall probabilities as we get a little bit further north away from the coast, about a 5 to 10% probability of seeing hurricane force winds from Orange to Lake Charles to Lafayette. So that is a little bit of a saving grace. Everybody's worried about the winds. Certainly, the overall probabilities of seeing hurricane force winds away from the immediate coastline is actually still very low at this point, at only about 5 to 10%. All right, now let's talk about the most likely time of arrival. When can we expect these winds to actually begin? And this hasn't changed a whole lot from earlier this afternoon. We're still looking at an onset of those tropical storm force winds between about 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. Wednesday morning. So we've been calling this kind of your deadline for making any kind of preparedness activities, or if you do intend to evacuate. The only evacuation order that I'm aware of right now is actually Lower Cameron Parish. But if you do decide that you want to evacuate, this is the time you need to do it by, because this will be when conditions will be beginning to deteriorate with those bands beginning to move ashore and those tropical storm force winds moving in. If you're planning on just hunkering down, this is the time that you'll need to be hunkering down by about 8 a.m. Wednesday morning. Coming back out here, if you've watched any of our briefings so far, this hasn't changed a whole lot. This is kind of discussing our forecast philosophy on why the storm is going to move the way it is. I know this is going to sound a little bit like a broken record for those of you who have been following me, but here's the tropical storm right now. We've got two main features that are kind of steering the storm. We've got a high pressure area over the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and we have clockwise winds that spin around areas of high pressure. That's what's kind of causing the storm to be moving to the northwest right now. Eventually, it's going to wrap around the kind of the periphery of that, and that's what's going to cause a more northward turn. And then it's going to essentially run into, this is a stationary cold front that's kind of sitting right off the coastline here. That's the cold front that's brought us to pretty nice conditions the last few days, but it's been sitting there just off the coast. And the winds within that are actually moving kind of easterly to northeasterly. As it begins to interact with that, that's going to cause it to turn more in a northeasterly direction, and that's where we're going to see an acceleration and a landfall as it moves off to the northeast. In addition to steering the storm, it's also going to produce some wind shear over the storm, such that the storm is expected to continue to intensify, but as it begins to encounter the winds associated with that frontal boundary, that's going to start to kind of tear it apart. So there is a possibility that as the storm approaches the coastline, it may begin to weaken or at least stop strengthening at that point. That's not a foregone conclusion, but at least that's the current thinking, that as the storm gets close to the coast, it'll start to feel that wind shear effect, and it'll start getting torn apart a little bit and might be slightly weaker or at least stop strengthening as it's making landfall. And that does make a difference in terms of overall impacts, because a storm that is strengthening, it has that momentum, it tends to result in stronger overall impacts or more significant overall impacts, whereas a storm that is not intensifying or perhaps beginning to weaken can oftentimes have significantly less impact. So that does make a big difference when it comes to actual storm impacts at the time of landfall. Overall, the conditions in the Gulf of Mexico, though, remain very favorable. We're still looking at sea surface temperatures in the upper 70s across most of the western Gulf, anywhere between 86 to 88 degrees. So that has been and continues to be favorable for tropical development. That wind shear I mentioned, let me go ahead and make this full screen for you, because this is kind of a messy graphic. The areas highlighted in red there, that's the areas of high wind shear that I was talking about associated with that cold front. As the storm begins to work its way into that area of higher wind shear, it may begin to encounter a little bit more of a hostile environment. But conditions right now across the western Gulf of Mexico are in a very low shear environment, so conditions remain favorable for additional intensification. The only limiting factor on it right now is that dry air that it's pulling in from Mexico, that it's kind of ingesting, if you will, into the center of circulation. So once that kind of stops and we get a little bit more moisture kind of wrapping around it, we expect that intensification to continue once again. So let's talk a little bit more about impacts across the region. You've seen this graphic already, no doubt, if you've been watching our earlier briefings. We are looking at a flash flood threat beginning as early as tomorrow afternoon into tomorrow evening. We're looking at about a 15% chance of seeing flash flooding, roughly from right around Beaumont to Lake Charles to Lafayette, New Iberia. Pretty much right along the I-10 corridor and south of there. We're going to be looking at the potential for some flash flooding as those outer rain bands begin to work into the region. By Wednesday, we're looking at the actual landfall of the storm and the bulk of the overall rainfall. You can see the higher overall risk extending pretty much across all of southwest Louisiana, south central Louisiana, southeast Louisiana, and even into southern Mississippi. That moderate risk is a 40% chance of seeing flash flooding within 25 miles of a location. For parts of southeast Texas, you're going to be on the west side of the storm right now, and you're going to be a little bit further away from the center of circulation. So that should result in some overall lower rainfall totals than is going to be seen across parts of Louisiana. So your overall risk is less for the potential for flash flooding. We do have a flood watch in effect across the region that is most likely to experience said flooding, as we just talked about. So that's pretty much all Louisiana parishes across southwest and south central Louisiana, as well as central Louisiana. And I'm pretty sure this flood watch extends into southeast Louisiana. It's just not shown here on this graphic. But there is a flood watch in effect for the potential for flash flooding. This is a look at the forecast rainfall totals, the latest iteration thereof. And we're looking at anywhere between about 6 to 8 inches of rainfall expected along the immediate coastline, and a large swath of 4 to 6 inches expected as we begin to work our way inward. Now, notice the sharp gradient between, say, Louisiana and the Texas line. We go from essentially a 4 to 6 inch line right here, and then a very narrow swath where we go effectively down to less than an inch in several locations as you get back into southeast Texas. That's often the case on the west side of tropical systems. There's very heavy rainfall just on the immediate western side, kind of in the western eye wall. But as you get away from that eye wall, there's significantly less rainfall. So even the overall risk for flash flooding is much lower across southeast Texas than it will be across parts of Louisiana. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when we're looking at these values, this doesn't account for that training effect that a lot of people are probably familiar with. And the idea is that these rain bands move in and they continue to move over the same area for hours and hours and hours and dump these very heavy tropical downpours. When you take that into consideration, we could very easily see over a foot of rainfall in those isolated locations. That's much higher than what's actually being indicated in the graphic that we were just looking at here. So keep in mind that is going to set up somewhere across the region. The problem is it's almost impossible to predict exactly where those bands are going to be until they actually set up across the area. But we know it's going to happen somewhere. It's just a matter of exactly where. So bear in mind that some parts of the region are going to see significantly more rainfall than what's being indicated on this graphic here. We are still looking at an overall significant storm surge threat as well, especially, it's going to be almost completely along and east of the center of circulation. 5 to 10 feet above, or 5 to 10 feet of storm surge is what's being anticipated essentially east of Cameron to Port Fourchon. From Port Fourchon to the mouth of the Mississippi, 4 to 7, and then east of the Mississippi, 2 to 4. Same thing west of Cameron to High Island. We're looking at 3 to 5 feet of surge. So significantly lower overall storm surge threat as you get west of Cameron Parish. And most of that surge is actually going to come very early on in the storm system. Because if you think about it, let me see if I can back up a little bit and just kind of give you an idea of exactly why that's going to occur. So obviously you have a storm here. It's an area of low pressure. So you have a counterclockwise rotation here. So as the storm moves north and approaches the coastline, you have these southeasterly winds that are going to develop ahead of it. So the initial winds are going to be out of the southeast. That's going to begin to pile some water up, say west of Cameron here. But once the center of circulation gets north of that area, these winds are going to then switch around out of the north, and it's going to push all that water right back out. So that's why, at least for parts of southeast Texas, west of Cameron, if you're going to see any kind of storm surge, it's going to be early on in this event. You're probably going to be looking at it more like Tuesday evening into Tuesday night, as opposed to the actual landfall location or landfall time, which isn't going to be until sometime Wednesday afternoon. Now, what I want to show you next here, this is a little bit more detailed map showing the storm surge threat and the potential for above ground level storm surge. You can see the highest risk is in the purple area there, where we're looking at inundation of 9 feet or greater, possible essentially east from Cameron. Coastal portions of Cameron Parish, coastal portions of Vermilion, Iberia, St. Mary, outside of the levee systems of Morgan City. So we are looking at a significant storm surge threat east of the center of circulation here. And you can see how that threat extends into even as far north as parts of northern Cameron Parish, kind of in the northeastern corner. That's, what is that, Rockefeller, the wildlife refuge out there. And then a little bit further north into parts of Vermilion Parish, which I think is also mostly part of the refuge there. So there's not a whole lot in terms of population out there, but still looking at a significant storm surge nonetheless across parts of south central Louisiana in and around the Vermilion Bay area. This will continue to get better refined and detailed as the storm approaches, and we get a better idea of exactly where that center of circulation is going to make landfall, because along and east of that center of circulation, you're going to see significant storm surge, and west of it, you're going to see very, very little. Of course, with all landfalling tropical systems, we are looking at a risk for tornadoes as well. I've gotten a lot of questions about tornadoes. Historically speaking and generally speaking, tornadoes form where the strongest rain bands set up, and that tends to be along and east or to the right of the center of circulation. So that's where we're anticipating the biggest threat of tornadoes with this storm. We had I think we had over 60 tornadoes, if I'm not mistaken, with Hurricane Beryl early this summer. So it is certainly something to be aware of, and that is a significant threat. Now, the interesting thing about tornadoes in hurricanes, they tend to be very short-lived, and they tend to move very, very quickly because they're moving with the gradient wind. So at some point, sometimes you may have a tornado that's moving at 50 or 60 miles an hour with those tropical storm force winds, and that's very, very fast compared to your typical tornado. So in a lot of instances, unfortunately, we're in a situation where we may not actually be able to see the tornado on radar to get a tornado warning out before it has already developed and then dissipated. A lot of times it'll develop between radar scans. It takes about 3 to 4 minutes for the radar to create a scan for us to view. And during that time, a tornado can very well develop, touch down, do some damage, and then lift back off in a hurricane. And sometimes the tornado paths can be quite long just because of how fast they're moving. So kind of bear that in mind, that there is a tornado risk, but there may not be a tornado warning. It's one of the few instances when people can say they were hit by a tornado without warning, because in some instances there's just not enough data there to issue a tornado warning. But anyway, the bottom line is there is going to be a tornado threat, essentially, that is going to exist roughly from Lake Charles east across all of southern Louisiana. The biggest overall risk right now looks like it's going to be south central Louisiana, along and east of that center of circulation. You can see the higher risk area, the slight risk area there is essentially right along where the forecast landfall point is, with and then essentially all the way east into southeast Louisiana as well. That is where the highest risk of tornadoes is going to exist with this system. Should that forecast track shift a little bit further back to the west or east, you will continue to see that tornado threat kind of shift accordingly along with it. So that's what we have here from the National Weather Service this evening. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around, and we'll do some Q&A time for the next little while here. If not, our next briefing will be 10:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. That is the schedule for tomorrow. We're going to be doing a 10:30 a.m. briefing, a 4:30 p.m. briefing, and a 10:30 p.m. briefing tomorrow. And then if we do have any kind of significant changes in the forecast, we may come in and do an impromptu briefing in between there if necessary, if there's something significant. But otherwise, those are going to be our scheduled briefings for tomorrow. So hopefully we'll see you back here for the latest and greatest at that time. And again, if you do have a question, feel free to stick around. We'll do that for the next few minutes here. Otherwise, we'll see you again tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. So I'm going to go ahead and back up here, and then I'm going to back up in my comments here. Oh, and for those of you who were asking, I just saw somebody had asked about it. When are we going to do the parish by parish breakdowns? I'm going to do that at the 10:30 a.m. briefing tomorrow morning. In fact, I've already put together the template. So I'll be here bright and early in the morning putting those together, and I will have those for you at the 10:30 a.m. briefing, and then they'll be posted to social media as well for you to distribute as widely as humanly possible thereafter. So yeah, we're going to do that again. We're going to do that tomorrow morning. I think by that point we'll have a pretty good idea with more specific impacts for each parish and county. I want to wait until we're feeling pretty good about the expected impacts, so we don't have to put it out there and then say, oh no, we were just joking. So that should be available. I'm planning on doing that tomorrow morning. All right, let's see what we have here in terms of questions. This is always fun time. Let's see what we got here. Adam says, should I repaint my kitchen? That's not the kind of questions I was talking about, Adam. But yes, I mean, it raises property values and it gives a nice aesthetic. Of course, you should repaint your kitchen. Maybe wait till after the hurricane. Courtney asks, what EF risk is expected? Example, most tornadoes are EF1s or greater. Generally speaking, in hurricanes, you tend to see weaker tornadoes. You see a lot of EF0s, a lot of EF1s. Now in Beryl, we actually had, I think we had a strong EF2, if not an EF3. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility to get, an EF2 or EF3 tornado, but the vast majority of tornadoes in hurricanes are pretty weak. They're EF0s or EF1s. Several people asking about the parish by parish. I already answered that. Again, we're going to do that tomorrow morning with the 10:30 a.m. briefing. Hugh's asking a serious question. Is it going to rain Wednesday? Yes. Straight and simple. Yes. I don't have to elaborate on that at all. Kelly's asking, what is the likelihood of the storm shifting back towards Lake Charles? It's getting less and less at this point. It's not out of the realm of possibility. Again, looking at the cone of uncertainty there, that extends roughly from the Louisiana-Texas state line to right around Houma or thereabouts. So there is still some room for wiggling back and forth there. I don't expect dramatic shifts, but we could see a shift a few miles back towards southwest Louisiana. I'm not saying that there's going to be a direct, where the eye is going to go right over Lake Charles necessarily, but any shift back to the west would be bad news for Lake Charles, better news for parts of south central Louisiana, and vice versa. If this stays where it is, this would be somewhat better news for Lake Charles and not so great news for those of you in and around Vermilion Bay. Nick says, my question, seems like stronger models have the storm moving straight north with weaker turning east. That's not odd. It's not odd necessarily because the intensity of a storm actually has a lot to do with how the steering currents that are around it interact with it. A stronger storm tends to be taller. It's more vertically stacked. So there's actually more surface area, for lack of a better term, for those steering currents to push against. A weaker storm tends to be shorter, more compact. There's less overall surface area, so there's less to push against. The other thing to keep in mind is the steering currents at different levels of the atmosphere. You may have winds blowing one direction at one layer, another at a different layer. And when you get those two, in different directions, that's how wind shear forms. But when they're blowing ever so slightly in different directions, the depth of the storm clouds and the storm layer does play a significant role in the overall movement of the storm. So it's not unusual that you'll get a situation where a weaker storm will be moving more in one direction and a stronger storm might be moving a little bit more in another. And that's likely what you're seeing there. Chantel says, we're in a mobile home in Franklin and St. Mary. Your thoughts on how bad it may be for us having to ride it out in a mobile home? The St. Mary Parish area is going to be looking at very strong tropical storm force winds, if not hurricane force winds. So you may want to consider seeking a more substantial shelter to ride out the storm. There are, again, no evacuation orders in place other than for Lower Cameron Parish that I'm aware of. But if you're in a mobile home and you're in an area that is likely to experience hurricane force winds, it would probably be a good idea to find a more substantial shelter. You may be okay, but I wouldn't hang my safety on maybe. I can't tell you what to do, but I wouldn't hang my personal safety or the safety of my family on a maybe. Adam asked, do we expect any kind of evacuation for Calcasieu Parish? Probably not based on the current forecast track. I can't say for certain. Again, that's outside of my jurisdiction. That is the emergency managers and your local elected officials calls to make. So you'd have to ask them at what point they would consider doing that. Darrell asked, the shifting eye wall didn't change the course west as expected. Why? I'm not sure that we were forecasting a shift in the eye wall. We did have an initial change or redevelopment of the circulation center earlier this morning. And that did initially result in a slight westward track shift. But since that time, the center of circulation has been much better defined, and most of our computer models are in pretty good agreement on the current forecast track that you see there. And so with that in mind, there was no reason to look at a significant forecast track shift back to the west. Michelle says, can you give me an excuse for work for the remainder of the week? Sure. Here's an excuse. There's a hurricane coming. Is that not a good enough excuse? I guess it depends on where you are. See if hurricane coming will work. You want me to write you a note? Send me an email. I'll write you a note. Jason asked, where can I buy a Donald Jones t-shirt? Anywhere black t-shirts are sold. They're pretty ubiquitous. You can find them anywhere. Chandra said, can you show the graphic for the updates tomorrow? I guess you're talking about the schedule for the briefings tomorrow. Sure, I can put that back up there for just a second here. There it is. I'll make that full screen for you. So again, we're going to do one 10:30 a.m. tomorrow, 4:30 p.m., and 10:30 p.m. tomorrow. Sebastian says, I work for Acadian and will be on shift. I'm in Lafayette. What should I expect? You're going to be looking at very strong tropical storm force winds. The tropical storm force winds are going to begin Wednesday morning. They're really going to kind of peak Wednesday afternoon, and then kind of gradually drop back down as we get into Wednesday night and Thursday morning. I do see a lot of questions here asking, what about this parish? What about that parish? What about here? What about there? I am going to do those parish by parish breakdowns tomorrow. I don't want to get too in the weeds on getting specific with everybody's location. So that's why I'm kind of avoiding those questions. I'm not just ignoring them, but I'd much rather address them all at once tomorrow morning. So I think that's what I'm going to try to do. Mike says, look like the models moved more east on the 0Z run. If this continues for the 4 a.m. update, do you think the National Hurricane Center moves the cone east? They may move the track a little bit further east. That's always a possibility. With the Hurricane Center is looking for, they use two primary components. One, they're looking for a consensus in the model. So if the model consensus shifts to the east, that gives them motivation to shift the track a little bit further to the east. But the other thing that they take into consideration is the pattern and how storms have behaved in similar patterns in the past. That's where the National Hurricane Center's expertise comes into play. So they take that into consideration. They also understand model biases. Some models tend to push storms a little bit further to the east or perhaps a little bit further to the west. Some storms tend to produce, or some models, I should say, tend to produce more rainfall than others. So they have a very strong understanding of those different model biases. So they may lean towards certain ensembles and away from others. So the Hurricane Center usually looks for consensus, but they don't always, their track doesn't always reflect right down the middle of the model consensus. Sometimes there is a little bit of leaning one way or the other. And that's based on their own expertise. Alicia says, what color shirt will you wear tomorrow? I'll give you 3 guesses. do. If you feel unsafe, you're always more at liberty to leave, but there are no evacuation orders in place right now. Carissa Lynn says there is a possibility it could shift to the east as far as New Orleans. It's not completely out of the realm of possibility, but it is kind of an outlier right now. If you look at that cone of uncertainty there, the actual New Orleans proper is not even in the cone of uncertainty at that point. We're looking at the easternmost portion of that cone is roughly right around Homa, or perhaps just a little bit east of Homa. So that's not a likely scenario at this point. Summer wants to know when we would expect rain bands to arrive in the Grand Lake Charles area. We're going to see rain bands, the outer rain bands, beginning to move into the area probably tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow evening at the latest. So we're going to see those outer rain bands. They're going to be well ahead of the actual landfall. The landfall is not expected until Wednesday afternoon, but we'll start to see some of those outer rain bands move into the area probably tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow evening. Hilario asks, is the casino a good place to evacuate to? That depends on what casino and how much money you have. No, I wouldn't evacuate to Bill's Truck Stop and Casino. If you're talking about, say, La Berge or Golden Nugget, those are relatively safe places. They stood up pretty well in our most recent hurricanes. So overall, they'd probably be pretty good places. They just charge a lot for you to hang out there. Brady asks, what time is the next update from the Hurricane Center? There will be an intermediate advisory at 1 a.m. The next full advisory from the Hurricane Center will be at 4 a.m. We're not going to do a briefing for that one because that's the witching hour of night. And hopefully we're all sleeping at that point. But the next full update will be at 4 a.m. And there is an intermediate advisory, which is essentially just an update to the intensity and the position of the storm that comes out at 1 a.m. Caden asked, do I think it's smart to dove hunt Wednesday morning? I'm going to go with no. I was trying to think of a witty response to that question, and I just don't have one. You've broken my brain, Caden. Tiffany asks, is there a good chance of this being I like the cat symbol, a Cat 3? That made me laugh. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a good chance, but there is a possibility. It's not out of the realm of possibility. We could see a Cat 3. The official forecast is for a Cat 2 with maximum winds of 100 miles per hour. John asked, this is a serious question and for fun. Where do you, me, think landfall will take place? I think landfall is going to take place right there. And you know why? Because for one, I generally trust the National Hurricane Center. And for two, for the consistency of messaging and the fact that I don't want to confuse people, even if I did think the forecast was going to be tracked somewhere else, I'd keep that to myself. But no, I do. I think the forecast is pretty reliable. Again, there could be a little bit of track shift one way or the other. 10, 20 miles wouldn't surprise me. But the latest runs of computer models have been fairly consistent to within just a few dozen miles or so. So I think this is a pretty solid forecast. Tina's asking about the timing of landfall. Did it change? No, we're still looking at a kind of mid-afternoon landfall time frame. Let me see if I can pull up the graphic here. Actually, that is probably the best way to show it. Let me go ahead and make this full screen for you here. So the graphic there you see is the landfall point is 7 p.m. Wednesday, but at that point it's already inland. So we're looking at landfall probably sometime between about 3 and 6 p.m. I've been calling it more like 4 to 6 p.m. For the landfall timing. That's the same as it was this afternoon, and it's a little bit faster than it was earlier this morning. So we're looking more kind of Wednesday afternoon time frame for that landfall. Josh says, my delivery and ability to field questions is exceptional, sir. You hear that? He called me sir. That makes me feel like I'm important or something. No, but thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. Nick says, I don't believe this cone for a second. It is drawn like the storm is already moving in an easterly direction. Meanwhile, the storm is still traveling north-northwest at 5 miles per hour. Yeah, but storms turn, and we're forecasting it to turn, and then it's going to turn and go northeasterly after that. That's why it's a forecast and not just what it's doing now. The computer models are in very good agreement on that turn. They're in very good agreement on the timing of that turn, and that it's going to occur probably sometime overnight tonight or very early tomorrow morning. So there's a lot of consistency there, and we have high confidence in that forecast. Sebastian asks, how long do you expect this to last once it hits? That depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about the hurricane force winds, those are only going to last probably a couple of hours, maybe even less than that. The tropical storm force winds are going to last a good bit longer. We're going to be looking at the winds beginning Wednesday morning and probably not coming to an end until sometime late Wednesday night, perhaps even very early Thursday morning. But we're going to be looking at probably about a 12 to 14 hour period there of at least tropical storm force wind gusts. John Doe, which is a classic name. Is there any chance that this shifts towards Houston? No, there's very, very low risk of a shift for the center of circulation towards Houston. You may see a little bit of rain out of it, but no, we're not expecting a shift back towards Houston. Renice asks, what side of the storm would produce tornadoes? Generally the east side or the right side, and that's where we're expecting the highest tornado risk, I should say, to occur. I'll pull the graphic up regarding that right here. And you can see the highest overall risk for tornadoes is in that slight risk, that yellow area. That is essentially along and east of where the storm is expected to make landfall. So kind of essentially from Lafayette down towards New Iberia, Morgan City, and then points further east into southeast Louisiana, Baton Rouge, the New Orleans area, the North Shore Lake Pontchartrain. Those areas are also at the higher overall risk for seeing tornadoes with some of those bands as they move across. Amanda asks, is there a possibility Shreveport would end up being in the cone again? Not particularly likely at this point. Based on the current track, which again we're fairly confident on, The Shreveport area is going to be on the west side of the storm and fairly far away from whatever remnants of the center of circulation are left. So you could probably see a little bit of rainfall with it, but I don't expect much in the way of wind impacts. I don't expect much in the way of a tornado threat. I don't expect much in the way of a flooding threat. The impacts across in the Shreveport area would be very, very low, unless there was some kind of significant shift back to the west, which we're not anticipating. Marissa's asking, what's an estimate for conditions to start to decline in Lake Charles Wednesday morning, and when will it move out? We're going to be looking at, as far as the timing for the start of the tropical storm force winds, we're going to be looking at roughly between about 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. You can see the graphic there. That is our most likely time of arrival for the tropical storm force winds. When are they going to end? We're looking at probably sometime late Wednesday evening. All right, trying to catch up. I'm falling behind again. Trying to find questions. I see a lot of conversations going on, which is fine. I'm just trying to find the questions. That's why I'm being quiet here. I haven't fallen asleep. Chandra asked, Donald, what's your favorite hurricane snack? Hurricane. We had this conversation, was it last year, a couple years ago? People still bring that back to me every now and again. We got to get some hurricane. Cindy asked, here in Morgan City, once it makes landfall, any idea how long the worst will pass, or how long the winds will take? Again, if we see hurricane force winds, those are only going to last probably a couple of hours at most. The tropical storm force winds are going to begin, like we just talked about, between about 6 and 10 a.m. Wednesday morning, and they're not going to drop below that consistently until probably sometime Wednesday night. So you're going to be looking at probably roughly about 2 hours-ish, 2 to 4 hours. I wouldn't even say 4 hours. We'll say 2 to 3 hours of hurricane force winds, assuming a Category 2 hurricane. And for tropical storm force winds, you're looking at probably about 12-ish hours. Felix says, keep up the good work. Thanks to the National Weather Service Lake Charles team. Fine work. Thank you, Felix, for that compliment. Felix is actually a former employee here, and he's been watching us fairly religiously recently, and we certainly appreciate him as well. Timmy asks, where is landfall going to be? Right now, landfall is forecasted for just to the east of Pecan Island in Vermilion Parish. That's the current landfall point. Now, that could change slightly, a few miles one way or the other, but that's what we're looking at right now. Lisa says, what will the sustained winds in Lake Charles be? you're probably going to more in gusts than sustain, but tropical storm force winds 50 to 60 miles an hour are certainly possible. Yes, I would recommend bringing your outside furniture in. I personally, I've done so. I went and did that this evening in between briefings here. I went and brought everything that was on my porch inside, just to be safe. Nothing wrong with that. Let's see. Just running through questions here, trying to catch up. Look, I'm only 3 minutes behind now. I'm making up ground. I'm trying to find questions that I haven't answered yet. Heather says, a daytime hurricane, nice. I was told by somebody earlier today that I needed to point that out because everybody always complains that hurricanes always make landfall at night, it seems like. So if this one makes landfall during the day, I've got to point it out as a, see, look, here's an example. Here's one that made landfall during the day. And this one is now expected to make landfall during the day. Now, of course, that could change, as all things, but at least for right now, it looks like a mid-afternoon landfall is the most likely scenario here. All right, looks like I've answered just about most of the questions here. I'm seeing a lot of repeats, which we could do that all night. So I'm going to kind of drop off here from that. This whole recording will be available, or this whole video, I should say, this live briefing will be available as a recording. The first 10 minutes are probably the most substantive because that's when we go through the actual briefing. So feel free to go back if you or still have a question that I didn't get to directly. Chances are I probably answered it there. If not, if you don't want to go listen to the whole thing, feel free to shoot me a direct message on Facebook. I'll be happy to answer your questions directly that way once we get off our briefing here. You can also send me an email directly. Email's on the screen there, as is our office phone number here. So you can email me at donald.jones, so it's my name with a dot in the middle, at NOAA, NOAA.gov. And I'll be happy to answer your questions that way. You can also give us a call here at our office, area code 337-477-5285. I'll be happy to answer your questions that way. We also are on X. I almost said Twitter, but it's X now. So feel free to send us a message that way. We're also on Instagram. You can send us a message that way. Again, the direct messages on Facebook. That's probably the quickest and easiest way because you're already here. So lots of ways to get in touch with us if you do still have any questions. Again, our next briefing will be tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. We'll have the latest and greatest from the National Hurricane Center at that time. I also do plan to have those parish by parish breakdowns of expected impacts with regards to Francine, which may be a little bit stronger by the time we get back to brief here in the morning again. So don't be surprised if that's the case. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your evening. It's Betty by time. It's 11:30. You need to go get some sleep. Next couple of days are going to be quite busy, so we all need to get a little bit of rest. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay dry, stay cool, clean, and comfortable. And we'll talk to you again tomorrow morning, 10:30 a.m.